Can I be heard?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Shesh. Well, first of all, let me say that really an excellent discussion. I've certainly learned more from it than I've contributed. I think both Krishnan and Vinayak have raised some very crucial questions and issues and so on. So let me make some very quick comments. First, on the issue of stakeholders, consultation with the states, I appreciate Vinayak making the point that the policy does contain some incentives for state governments. That's good, I think. But I think the problem that really arises is that, the theory of monetizing existing assets in order to build more assets raises the question that if I'm monetizing an asset in Tamil Nadu in order to build a new one in Andhra Pradesh, would the state government of Tamil Nadu be a little happier if it was being done, if I was monetizing the asset in Tamil Nadu in order to build another asset in Tamil Nadu itself? Now, I'm not saying, I don't want to go too far down this road, but you can imagine a situation where successful assets are usually in the better developed states and the lack of infrastructure in the less developed states. So it is the monetization will occur of the assets in the better developed states and will ultimately be used to generate assets in the less developed states. To some extent, this is perfectly reasonable. But maybe an incentive would be that whenever an asset is monetized, X% of it will be used to create another asset in the same state. That, I think, would slightly improve the degree of stakeholder connection. The second thing really relates to land. I mean, that is the biggest problem. And, you can't separate the state government from the land, because when you're selling these things, the land is actually given for a specific use. I mean, if Hindustan Photo Films is being sold, then the land that it sits on cannot be used for any other purpose without the state government authorizing that to happen. So I think there needs to be clarity whether we are actually freeing up the use of land, because that would be reflected in transparent bidding, or are people just buying the asset in the hope of later on doing a deal with the state government, shutting down the enterprise and capitalizing on the value of the land? I mean, all these hotels, for example, that's the biggest problem, because 3/4 of the hotels that the ITDC owns are sitting on lands which have been given by state government, or are, if not given, they've been authorized by state governments only for use as hotels. So if the hotel is making no money at all, the assets itself has a huge amount of capital locked in, but that capital can only be realized if it's transparent whether that will be freed. And in the absence of transparency, people always assume that some cronies will buy up the land, buy up the asset, and then hope to do a deal with the state government in order to get the freedom on the land. That's a big, big problem that really needs to be addressed. I completely agree with what Vinayak said, that on the issue of how to take care of PPP problems, the Kelkar report is an excellent report. I mean, I think the first thing that the government should do is to set up a high-level committee to quickly look at the report and decide once for all, I mean, is it accepting it or not accepting it? It would be perfectly okay to say we've considered this report and reject it, because then people will try to build something different from what is put in the report. But completely ignoring a report that was, I think, submitted several years ago, and then getting other guys to start solving the same problem again seems a little wasteful. So I really do think that going back to the Kelkar, I've read the report, and I think we were thinking along these lines. It has done an excellent job of putting together all the accumulated knowledge that there was. I'm still not certain that the proposal to set up some high-level outside committee to do renegotiation, whether that will actually ever fly. Because I think in order to become totally transparent, it will in all probability be staffed by people who will be as resistant to change as a normal civil servant is. But I think if they were given very clear guidelines, it would definitely be an improvement. So I think we should certainly look for that. I think those are the main points that I wanted to comment on. But I agree with what one point very strongly agree with what Vinayak said. You know, it's true that the appetite at the moment for new investors, whether domestic or foreign, to come into new greenfield infrastructure is virtually zero, simply because the construction risk, the possibility of motivated interventions, interrupting construction, etc., are too high. And therefore, it makes sense for the next 2 or 3 years to concentrate on monetizing the brownfield asset. Now, my feeling is that when we do that, 3 years later, the risk perception will change. Because if you have a lot of projects that are actually being run by private operators successfully, etc., I think the perception that the country is now ready for PPP will change. So I wouldn't rule out new greenfield PPP in any means, but he's right that simply relying on it now without demonstrating that we can do a good job in this area is not very, very productive. And you know, it's I mean, yes, he's right that it's far too ambitious, but that's okay. I mean, look, Manmohan Singh used to say about planning that, you know, a man's reach must exceed his grasp. So the name of the game is not whether they go from 2.5 to 6 lakhs. So if they go from 2.5 to 4.5 lakhs, I mean, some people will say, look, you haven't met your target, but on the other hand, you did a hell of a lot better. So I would not set too rigid the guideline to judge success. I'd just say, look, in the next 3 years, can we increase what was done in the past 5 years by 40%, 50% or so, even if you can't double and treble it? Thank you.
Thank you, Mantek. I just want one very, very important point that Vinayak flagged, not to go unnoticed. The enormity of the task in terms of scaling up from the 2.5 lakhs to 6.5 lakhs, and talking about funds, the Canadian pension funds and the sovereign funds from UAE as the solution for that has a certain risk. Particularly, I'm realizing this in the last few weeks when I've been in discussion with some sovereign funds on this very matter, that the pricing is going to be significantly higher because of the country and exchange risks embedded in this. And therefore, I'm a little scared to look at the kind of impact that will have on the user charge if the returns have to be met. And therefore, the whole issue of renegotiations popping up pretty quickly if there were to be any crystallization of the risk in any manner going forward. And that circles back to what Viswanathan started with in terms of the experience that Neyveli Lignite had, of having to have a liability which was much beyond what was initially contracted for. And that's the kind of scenario that could just unravel. I think in the interest of time, I will stop there. Mantek.
Yeah, there's just one point I want to make, that, you know, Vinayak is right to have pointed out the importance of these funds wanting to come in. You know, keep in mind that if these funds come in, let's say they pick up a 4-lane road, they may well become interested in expanding it to a 6-lane road 2 or 3 years down the road. I mean, so what looks like a brownfield, almost all our roads actually have available land, which can in fact be used to expand the road. Their willingness to do such a thing, which would become a new kind of a greenfield project, piggybacking on a brownfield project, would be much greater if they've gained experience with actually implementing it. That is, the operator who's actually implementing it might be willing to do this expansion, and these same guys would be happy to fund the expansion.
Mantek, there, I think there is an issue relating to the profile of the investor. Some of the funds that we talked about, named, are typically those who look for safe haven annuities and not venture into greenfield operations. But on the other hand, the profiles of entrepreneurs who can come into this in the hope that they have an ability or an opportunity to build greenfield size on top of the brownfield. That's the kind of profile that we should really be coveting, because they are the people who are going to be creating new assets as well and connecting the dots, which is what I mentioned. But I think this is a discussion for another day. I think I was just going to echo what you said, that personally I've gained a lot more than what I have contributed, several times more. And if that's the feeling the rest of the participants have, then I think, Viswanathan, you've met your objective of getting all this outstanding people coming together. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Mr. Sesh, I think Mr. Nayak Chatterjee, did you want to say something else? I saw you put up your hand. Is there a final quick comment you wanted to make as well before we?
Very quick comment. You know, we tend to think that there are only two models, greenfield and brownfield. Since we are talking colors, let me advance an intermediate model and let me call it bluefield. There is a concept called plug and play, where the government sets up 100% SPV. That SPV acquires the land and gets all the clearances, project and all the permissions, and then sells that SPV to the private sector. So it removes development risk, but still keeps construction risk. So remember, there is an intermediate model called plug and play, which I'm calling bluefield, which would be a very useful intermediate step to move backwards from what we are saying now, from brownfield to greenfield. You can stop at the station called bluefield, which is plug and play. The government has not taken this seriously. The only person who applied this was Mr. Shahi when he was Secretary Energy, when the 4 ultra mega power plants, UMPPs, were offered on a plug and play concept during the UPA time. And that was a very good model. That's all.
Just a couple of points. Just one that, it's interesting that the point was made about the Kelkar committee and having a kind of a common framework on which PPP is done. I just want to reflect on this, that although the Government of India has been thinking about a procurement act and a PPP procurement act for many, many years, it's still not happened. TN is probably one of the few states which has not just a procurement act, but also a PPP set of rules, which are fairly robust and workable. But for various reasons, of course, PPPs haven't taken off at all, but at least we have an operating framework within which, and it's the same set of procedures and processes that across departments we need to follow, and you won't have a lack of uniformity in the way that the process works. And I think that's a very important point that Mr. Chatterjee made, that you need a standard process which everyone understands. And I think that is critical. How you'll evaluate the project, how you'll put together the entire procurement process and how it works. And again, the capacity point is something that he reiterated. And again, the plug and play is another model which, yes, we do adopt, especially for industrial infrastructure, where you need it for various kinds of industrial parks, and that option is certainly. So let me just thank you.
Right.
Thank you all, Vish.
I'm actually going to